Your perfect domain.
Do you need an easy way?
Shake it like you mean it, baby. Come on and dance with it. Come on. Shake it like you mean it, baby. Come on and dance with it.
Hello, hello. Happy Monday. Excuse me. Oh, I was just stuffing down a piece of pizza. I made pizza last night. It was very good. Thanks, Druid. So I will acknowledge the fact it looks like I've had a chemical peel. I have not. It's some kind of allergic reaction. Usually when I have like face involved allergic reactions, my sinuses are crazy, my eyes are watering and itchy. Not the case. Just a lot of red, itchy swelling on my face. So I think after this, I'm going to have to take some Benadryl. I've been holding off all day because as soon as I take Benadryl, I'll be unconscious for at least 24 hours. So happy spring. So today, I thought I would do something a little bit different. I have so much more miniature stuff, but Jill and I are probably gonna use some of those as well on our our other stream. Excuse me. And probably take a break and get back into some basics. So I had been looking at a few things, and I'm going back to two names you might remember. It's been a while, but their names are Tandy Hirsch and Jeanette Lasansky. They are both quilt scholars quilt scholars operating in Pennsylvania. Now, Tandy Hirsch, she passed away, I think it was in 2020, or no, yeah, 2020, I think. Her husband had preceded her in death, but they had a collection and a lot of coverlets, samplers, coverlets, and their files, and I assume some of their collection are actually at the Winneter. So, you know, next best thing, right? And then Jeanette Lasansky, she's written all of these great books, and I don't know what she's up to today. I know that, her name is out there on a lot of these great publications, and I assume maybe she's older. She's not researching anymore. I'm not sure. I wasn't sure if she was still with us, and I can't find any any proof she's not. So she's out there. I just don't know. I'm assuming, southeastern Pennsylvania. But she wrote a series of books. And the ones that I really loved is Pieced by Mother. And we're gonna look at something in this book, which is her writing, Pieced by Mother. And then there are these symposium papers that go along with Pieced by Mother. And these are also very good. And you can find these books out there. So the symposium papers are not just Jeanette Lasansky. Tandy Hirsch has a piece in here. I think, does this one have Barbara Brackman? I think this one's got Barbara Brackman. So this is from 1987. So these have been around for a while. But I think it's like really good, solid. Yeah, Brackman's in here. What's in a Name? Quilt patterns from 1830 to the present. Mid 19th century album and friendship quilts, Ricky Clark. So there's and actually I was Geraldine Johnson, let's see, More for Warmth Than for Looks, Quilts of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So really good stuff in here, and this is kind of like your fundamental like quilt study and quilt documentation and all that kind of stuff. Check this out. It is a diagram of what goes on a bed. Pennsylvania German bed. So you've got feather pillows, feather bolster, straw bolster, coverlet, feather bed, bed sheet, chaff bag, which I'm assuming is, filled with straw or chaff. What is chaff? Chaff would be wheat. Like, is that like the debris from processing wheat? But I do know that straw and corn husks and things like that were used for like I guess what we would consider box springs for its firmness, and then you'd have a soft feather bed on top of that. So it's pretty cool. It's interesting that they have this, and let's see who wrote this one. This is by Alan Keyser. Beds, Bedding, Bedsteads, and Sleep. Early Pennsylvania German Traditions. So this is very interesting. This is something that I wish I'd read when we were looking at Anne Hermey's book about the Pennsylvania pillowcases, because I mean, that's kind of the gist of what this paper's about. And my guess is she probably referenced this paper and I never realized it. So anyway, we're going to look at quilt documentation and quilt study. And so the quilt documentation article is here in Pieced by Mother, over 100 years of quilt making traditions. And like I said, this whole book is Jeanette Lisansky. And we are going to look at Tandy Hirsch. It is a brief study of a quilt from 1809. And the reason why I wanted to kind of pair these two together is this idea of, documenting quilts and studying them. And, I often get questions about that. Like when I tell people I'm a researcher and that I study quilts, I'm a member of the American Quilt Study Group, they kind of are like, oh, cool. But I can see behind their eyes, they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That sounds weird. What does that mean? Right? So, I thought we could look at this and sort of get from the horse's mouth, I suppose, sort of better than I can necessarily just, say without preparation. And for some reason, my computer is being very silly today. So bear with me. That's why I was kind of late signing in. Starting the stream, because Monday. It's got a case of the Mondays, I suppose. Okay, so trying to get these. I forgot to make sure that these were lined up, the pictures. There's not a whole lot of pictures, but just enough, Always like to have a little visual aid. Okay, so I want to start with quilt study because that's the shorter one. And let me put this on the screen so that you can see this is a drawing, an author's drawing of the quilting on the quilt that we are going to examine in this journal. This is the journal of the American Quilt Study Group. It's called Uncoverings. I've mentioned it probably many times. This is 1982. So this is the third year that they published. So volume 3. And this is a fairly short piece. So without further ado, some aspects of an 1809 quilt, Tandy Hirsch. And then here's the little byline. Martha, her real name is Martha Tandy Hirsch. Martha Tandy Hirsch, who comes from a long line of Kentucky quilters, is a textile researcher and lover of old fabrics. And this is the part I love. Her address is... it is a box number. And it seems like... So she's at the Carlisle Barracks. So I don't know. I mean, is there a Carlisle, Pennsylvania, like army base? I'm not sure. In any event, 1982, she was in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, but she's originally from Kentucky. And I believe when she passed away, she was living in Maryland. I saw the obituaries for both her and her husband. So some aspects of an 1809 quilt, Tandy Hirsch. In 1968, the Smithsonian Institution offered a course entitled Textiles for their associates program. Rita Androsco, Doris Bowman, and Gladys Cooper, the ABCs of the Division of Textiles, And did you notice what their last names were? Androsco, Bowman, Cooper, ABC. Isn't that cute? The ABCs of the Division of Textiles at that time lectured on facets of tapestry, linens, the spinning wheel, coverlets, flags, quilts, the sewing machine, and other subjects. They used the finest quality examples from the Smithsonian's collection to illustrate the lectures. In the session on quilts, they showed us a glazed wool quilt made in Vermont in the late 18th century, with the finish still as shiny as today's glazed chintz. Thanks to that course and that particular quilt, I found the subject of this paper. I live in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in the Cumberland Valley, where the first Scotch-Irish settler came in 1725. By 1731, 400 Scotch-Irish families had settled in the area and began a significant influx in that decade, which resulted in a preponderance of the population at the time of the American Revolution. The descendants of one of these families, the McCulloughs, sold their household goods and farm equipment at an auction in 1980. Discarded and pushed back into a corner was a damaged quilt folded with the backing side out. On examination, it proved to be the same type of material as that in the Smithsonian quilt. One of my friends tells me I am a textile salvager instead of a textile collector, and I think she's correct. Rather than search for perfect items only, I look for textiles which have come apart, as they provide an opportunity to study construction techniques. And I love that. Our friend Pam Weeks at the New England Quilt Museum, she uses a term called opportunity hole. So when you have a quilt that's got like a little hole in the seam, you can very gently look in there and see what's going on. But when you have a damaged quilt, you have lots of ways to peek inside and see what's happening. It bothers me that these frayed things, created with such effort in an earlier time, have outlived the purpose for which they were made. So the torn, incomplete, faded, and repaired fabrics become my favorite things and afford me a chance to learn from them. The quilt was only a study piece the day of the auction, and though I have tried to make it seem otherwise, that is a silk purse out of a sow's ear, it is still a study piece rather than a showpiece. My purpose in this paper is to present a micro-analysis of this quilt. And so that's essentially an analysis, a study of the quilt. Sally Garrett's paper, Early Colonial Quilts in a Bedding Context, in Uncoverings 1980, was a macro-analysis in comparison, the study of a large number of quilts mentioned in wills and inventories in given areas and times. I will describe and analyze one glazed wool quilt with the date September 13th, 1809, and the initials MRM and then a lowercase c, so M. McCullough, perhaps, quilted along one edge, and compare it with similar quilts to determine what can be learned by this approach. The quilt measures 80 inches wide and 95 inches long. It weighs 7½ pounds and is made of 3 layers of wool. The decorative top has 60 10-inch squares set as diamonds. And you can see in the picture, like, this is what she's talking about. There are 22 equal-sized triangles around the edges and a smaller triangle at 2 corners. The pattern of the top is achieved by alternating solid watermelon pink and black squares. Pink and black? Cool. The backing is a dull apricot wool material, and the filling is wool fibers. So the front of this quilt then was alternating black and watermelon pink squares of wool, with the backing being an apricot colored wool, so the back, and then the filling is wool fiber, so assuming that it's, combed wool fleece from some sheep. The worn aspect is that all of the black glazed wool squares, 50% of the quilt top, have disintegrated. The wool backing has extensive edge damage. The filling shows through, and surely we may regard it as another salvaged textile. In the spirit of this detailed study of one quilt, we will first analyze the materials from which it was made, and then consider the construction process. The primary focus of our study, however, will be the quilting itself, especially the design elements and how they are combined. Following this, we will compare this quilt with others of its type and finally draw some conclusions. Analysis of the materials. Imported wool textiles were important furnishings in colonial homes. By the middle of the 18th century, moreen, camlet, harratine, cheney, calamanco, and other wool fabrics were listed in the inventories of estates in America. The more affluent families used these materials for bed hangings and coverings, upholstery, curtains, and clothing. Some of these expensive fabrics were made in America, but the majority came from England and France. This lightweight wool cloth had plain, glazed, and watered surfaces. Damask-like designs permanently embossed in it by heat or pressure, and was dyed in beautiful colors. So I'm assuming, plain, of course, is just like plain wool, like you can imagine. Glazed wool, and I think Calamanco might be one of the glazed versions. It's very high heat and pressure. So if you can imagine, if you've ever like over ironed some wool and it gets shiny, like the elbows of a suit jacket, that somebody has worn a million times, and it starts to get shiny. That's how it's that sort of felting and pressure and heat that makes that sort of glazed look. They also, I think, probably had some type of like something that they would put on the fabric, some sort of sizing, I guess, or something like that. But it sounds like, so watered surfaces is not something that I've heard before. And I'm assuming this is what when she describes damask-like designs embossed with heat and pressure, I'm assuming is what she means by watered surfaces. Very interesting. The colored photographs in American Quilts and Coverlets by Bishop and Safford and Women's Day Book of American Needlework by Rose Wilder Lane will give an idea of the color range. So I'm guessing that this quilt then maybe was in those books, or maybe she's just talking about quilts in those books. Flowers, stripes, varying size weft threads for texture, different weave structures, plus the fact that it was fairly fire retardant, made wool very desirable as a furnishing fabric. And did you know that wool is, it's not flame resistant. You can burn wool, but it's flame retardant. It doesn't ignite easily, right? Rose Wilder Lane. Yeah. Is this one of the Wilder, as in Laura Ingalls Wilder? Is that her? Is that her daughter? I feel like I'm trying to remember. I know that the name has come up before. Now I'm totally blanking. Rose Wilder Lane, yeah. I do remember that we know her, but I can't remember why now. It's got to be Laura Ingalls Wilder relation, right? Okay. Where did I just leave off? Yeah. So wool is fire retardant. It's good. So like I have a hearth rug in front of my wood stove, and it is wool. It's 100% wool, because if sparks come out of the stove, like little embers, they will burn the wool, but it won't like ignite the way that, say, or melt the way that, say, a synthetic synthetic fabric. Okay, so that was her. Yeah. Okay. Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter. Yeah. I completely forgot about that as I'm reading it, but now that you bring it up, we do know her. Good memory, Druid. It is difficult to give names and processes of manufacture to specific wool fabrics made in the 18th century because of lack of documentation at the time of production. Many definitions of fabric names were written in the late 19th century and are not necessarily accurate for 18th century processes. So I will use the larger classification of glazed wool when I refer to the top. Glazing was accomplished by applying heat or pressure on fabrics after preparing its surface with a solution. So what I just explained. So there was a solution involved. Heat or friction removed short fuzzy hairs and a smooth light reflecting cloth resulted. Calamonico seems to be the current name most often associated with glazed wool. Yay, I was right. You can't even imagine how, when I will spout a fact and then it be proven correct, like in the next paragraph, you don't know how much like that gives me such joy. Because an equal number of times I'm proven wrong by the next paragraph. So Hazel E. Cummins' article, Calamonico, in the magazine Antiques, quotes from early English and French publications describing wool fabrics. The characteristics of Calamonico evoke adjectives like crisp, lightweight, glossy, plain, solid, beautiful, clear colors, and all of these seem to describe the material in this 1809 quilt. There was one problem, however, in referring to this cloth as Calamonico, since the 18th century French source describes the weave structure of Calamonico as a 5-harness satin weave. So what that means is it would be like 5, like the weft threads would float like over 5 warp threads, I think, or under 5 warp threads. So you have these long floats, and that's what gives things that satin look. If you look at, a piece of satin, it doesn't matter if it's like silk or just, polyester or whatever. But if you look at that weave, you can see, and you kind of, just sort of like run your fingernail over it, you can see that the long, shiny fibers are floating over weft, and it's staggered. So that's what gives it that like really smooth, silky feel, satiny feel. The weave structure of our quilt is plain weave, and plain weave is like over, under, equal numbers. One interesting small discovery is somewhat gratifying on this point. Our quilt maker used 2 scraps of black satin weave material. One is a corner triangle, and the other piece would never have been seen if the black material of one block had not deteriorated, exposing a hidden patch of reinforcement done in reverse applique. The patch is sewn with large linen stitches on the hidden underside and almost invisible stitches on the top. The individual threads in the glazed wool top are finely spun, and there are 48 threads per inch in both warp and weft. The threads are not plied, but are called singles. And so what that means is if you look at, even thread right off of a spool, you can see, like, kind of tease it apart. It's actually 2 pieces that have been plied together. So what she's saying is this is just a single strand of spun thread versus, twisted together. It's less strong because when you twist them together, any issues with like short fibers kind of teasing apart are, you're not necessarily eliminating that, but you're making it less likely to pull apart. So the threads are not plied, but are called singles, and except as noted above, are woven in a balanced plain weave. There are 3 colors: black, watermelon pink, and shrimp. So it's shrimp now instead of apricot. Now, I guess think about this: shrimp and apricot. See, I think of apricot as being a little more orangey, and shrimp as being a little more pinky. Like almost kind of close to the watermelon color to me, if I think about it. Interesting. The shrimp was used to complete the top. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. The shrimp is on the front. So shrimp and watermelon are close. See, next sentence proved me wrong. So she's not talking about the back. The shrimp was used to complete the top when the pink scraps ran out. An examination of hidden folds demonstrates these colors have not changed and the material is well preserved. And so probably many of you have seen an old quilt that is coming apart. And if you look particularly in the folds or any place where it's coming apart, you know, like within seams, you'll sometimes be able to lift up a little bit and see the original color underneath this in the seam allowance. And, you know, even you could even literally like clip a stitch just to be able to pull that open and see. And it can be very helpful because sometimes fabrics fade a lot. But I think the wool doesn't fade as much as cotton does. The black pieces have changed to a dark black-green color, and their poor condition could be the result of corrosive black dyes or from the black being a recycled material in 1809. Some squares are made of two smaller pieces seamed together to make the 10-inch square. Very likely all of this material was commercially made and was not the product of a single artisan. A final observation on the satin weave piece should note two tan-colored threads in the selvage. Ruth McKendry, in Traditional Quilts and Bed Coverings, reports 3 blue selvage threads appear in cotton exported from England between 1774 and 1811. So I think what she's saying here is these have tan-colored threads in the selvage versus the 3 blue threads. And if I remember correctly, well, make sure she's not gonna, okay. The 3 blue threads were required in England, and I can't remember if it's for exports or if it's just, you know, as proof that it was woven in England. I'm not sure. I can't remember, but those 3 selvage threads are very specific in English fabrics. And I guess what she's saying, the satiny piece has these 2 tan-colored threads, so it is quite likely from here, you know, from the US versus from England or France. The filling is a thin layer of carded wool fibers spread between the top and back. The dull apricot-colored backing appears to have been used possibly as a blanket made of 3 lengths seamed together before it was cut into 7 pieces to fit the top of the quilt. It is singles wool, but has only 28 warp threads and 32 weft threads per inch. Heavier individual threads than those on the top, and is a 2/2 twill weave. So what that means is it's like over 2, under 2, over 2, under 2. And then the next row shifts. So it might be like it shifts by 1. And so then you see it like the most common twill is like, look at your pants, you know, denim jeans are, you know, your Levi's are twill weave. You know, many types of twill pants are a twill weave. And it's just, I think it's just because it's stronger than just the over under. It is hand spun Z twist. Z, if you're not aware of twist, Z twist is spun one direction, twisted one direction. S twist is the other one, and it is twisted the other direction. And I can't remember. I think it's if you were to say take the thread and like blow it up and look at the tip of it, I think depending on which direction it's twisted, it literally looks like a Z or an S. I think that's the gist of what Z and S twist means. Okay, so it's hand spun, Z twist, and hand woven with the diagonal line of the twill erratic, indicating the uneven beat of a non-professional weaver. So what that sounds like to me is it's like maybe the weft threads are a little wonky because the weaver wasn't the beat is pressing the woven layers down. So it sounds like, you know, maybe that wasn't well done. It too has its story to tell. Areas are darned. A neat repair patch was made before it was quilted. And so before it was quilted, so a quilt is new. It hasn't even been quilted yet, and there's already a patch on it, a repair, which tells us that this indeed probably was a blanket or some other type of, you know, in use. A neat repair patch was made before it was quilted, and there is an 1 3/4 band of a different weave in it. Well, that's interesting. Perhaps the weaver used a different treadling to spread the warp as she began to weave. This band was woven with 1 twill shot followed by 1 plain weave shot instead of 4 successive twill shots. This material, after processing, measured 34 1/2 inches wide, a typical width of seamed blankets of this period. So you see so far, like we're only on materials, and this is the analysis that she's doing. Now, obviously, if you were just getting started and you don't necessarily have these reference materials, like she's talked about Ruth McKendry and Rose Wilder Lane, and she's read a lot, obviously. But if you just have an old quilt and you're just starting out, the measurements and the way that the weave looks to you, even if you can't particularly name it, but what the weave looks like and the colors, and if there's any fading, if there's damage, all of these things you can document, even if you know nothing about, these fancy fabric names she's using and such. That could all come later, in terms of studying a quilt. And one thing I think that's useful to do, and kind of suggest here in the picture, this drawing, she's used this drawing to map out the quilting, but you could also use something like this to map out damage on a quilt, or you could use it to map out signatures or other things on a quilt. You see lots of these kind of diagrams, and unless you're publishing it in a book, it doesn't have to be pretty. If it's just for your research and for your documentation, then something fairly simple would work. But this is just into the materials. So now we'll start construction. The Scotch-Irish lady joins the materials with linen, wool, and cotton threads. So 3 types of thread. Interesting. All squares have been seamed together with 2-ply unbleached linen thread in back stitch with 8 to 9 stitches per inch, of course by hand. The sewing machine was patented 37 years later. The seam allowances vary, but 3/8 of an inch is an average. The edges of the top are folded down 1/2 inch toward the back. The back edges are folded down 1/2 inch toward the front, and these 2 folded edges are sewn together with 2 straight rows of quilting. This was an effective finish because on the 2 sides where the material remained well preserved, the edges are intact. All of the quilting threads are 3-ply wool, black thread on black squares, rusty red thread on pink squares, and there's an average of 5 stitches per inch. So I would say that's probably like average of what you could get with wool thread on a 3 layers of wool. And although this is not a Welsh quilt, we're presuming this was made here in the US. But Welsh quilts were like that. They, very thick. Even if it was a very thin batting, the fabrics themselves could still be very thick. And so that is why they would have used either, larger stitches or more likely the back stitch. That's why they would back stitch, because you just can't even, like the finest quilting of rocking the needle, that fabric, when the fabric, folds over and bunches up, it's just too thick to make teeny tiny stitches unless you were pulling it up and going back down one at a time. And that takes forever. So this makes sense. The 3-ply rose-colored cotton thread was used to patch and darn the backing and overcast the 4 smaller backing pieces together. 2-ply wool, the same color as the backing fabric, was used to overcast the longest seam between the 2 largest pieces. Okay, so I'm going to show you another picture. So, design elements. The bold, dominant design feature in the quilt is the alternating, contrasting colored squares set in a diamond pattern. It is a design used in decorating 18th century floors and floor cloths, as illustrated in Rodris Roth's floor coverings in 18th century America. These bold contrasts point up the fact that the quilt is not balanced and has no center square in either direction. So if we go back, yeah, there really is no center. You know, nothing like, you know, you could imagine, like, even if you kind of traced out a medallion in here, the number of squares across, like, it doesn't work out to make anything, you know, a medallion. It would look like the medallion quilts that were some of the medallion quilts at QuiltCon, where they're off-centered, and theirs was by choice. Whereas this one, you know, just by virtue of the number of blocks, you know, wide and tall, that a medallion center is just not possible here unless it was offset. Okay. The recessive feature, one that gives texture and subtle light changes, is the quilting. Because the quilting threads match the fabric, the designs do not stand out as they would if the threads were contrasting. Black on black, even viewed closely, is hard to see. Study of these quilting designs in the individual squares demonstrates what all quilters know. That is, the combination of a few simple shapes, when repeated in an orderly manner, compound and become the basis of all quilting. And she's referencing Figure 1, a drawing of the whole quilt, shows what our quilter created with the circle, intersecting circle, the half circle, straight lines, and the spiral form, which is what she's referencing here. This drawing attempts to copy designs, errors, and irregularities faithfully. Let's go back and look at it because she's going to keep talking about it. The quilter took each 10-inch square as a separate area unrelated to the next, and using curved and straight lines composed a unique design, and then moved to the next square for a new composition. She did duplicate within the 60 blocks many times, but only once do 2 identical blocks lie adjacent to each other, so you can see the effect of the completion of intersecting circles. There is a combination of free-drawn patterns and the use of guides, such as an 8-inch plate for the large circle and a template for the 8 and 12-petaled roses. All the other designs are unmeasured and not uniform. So I'm guessing she's saying, like, there's patterns for these, you know, the circles, but some of this other fill work is just hand eyeballed. In Figure 2, get back over there. So Figure 2, row 1 shows the simple, fundamental shapes from which all the patterns are developed. So she's calling this a row. This is a column. Sorry, Tandy, this is a column. So she's saying these are the basics, like we already had demonstrated, the basic pieces. Row 2, so these 2 right here, shows 2 squares with examples of backgrounds or overall patterns, cross-hatching and shells. And so you can see this one is the shells. So it's they're a little curved, almost like scales. And then this is just the cross-hatching. The next line shows the 6 corner patterns the quilter used: 2 fans, concentric quarter circles, a single quarter circle, diagonal lines, and one in which all ribs of a fan emanate from a point on the long side of the triangle. So that's what these are here. In the center of many blocks, she drew a large circle and put a 12-petal rose, spiral shapes, and interlocking circles inside, sometimes putting scallops around the edge, sometimes not. Other times, she used scallops without a large circle. Midway between the corners on the edge of various squares, she made 2 concentric arcs, 3 shells, 4 petals, are two nested L-shaped lines. Hearts developed from two ribs of the fan. These are geometric designs. There are no large-scale squares, no vines, grapes, plumes, feathers, tendrils, or designs based on nature. You can see the variety of combinations of patterns, the lack of orderly placement of the patterns, and the mistakes. But being quilters and people who study quilts, you can also see the potential from any single block pattern to its compounding, and thus to its becoming the overall quilting design for a single quilt. I was so busy finding the date block after I got home from the auction and trying to research the settlement of the area and the maker by searching deeds, genealogies, and cemetery records that I didn't study the quilt and missed the point that is obvious now, but that my husband had to suggest. The quilt is indeed a sampler of quilting designs which could be referred to for subsequent use. My interest then shifted to the source of the designs. Is it possible that the rural area of Cumberland County, with the McCrae, McCullough, McKinney, McMeans, McMurray, McCormick, McKeon, and other Scotch-Irish names, or Scotch-Irish families, was so insular that in 1809 these ladies were still using the designs the families brought here in the 1730s? Avril Colby's book Quilting, which we have read, written in England with much of the research done in the British Isles, has cross-hatching, shells, fans, roses with scallop petals, concentric circles, intersecting circles, even the idea of spirals left and right off of a vertical line. And she mentions, she's talking about specifically where in Avril Colby's book. So she's talking about chapter 4 is where they appear. Photographs of 18th century articles on which these designs were quilted are in chapter 8 of the book. I have not taken the next step to research other cultural backgrounds of quilting, so I can't say with confidence that the design elements of our quilt are definitely from the British Isles, but certainly there is an affinity. And I will stop right here and say, well, Tandy, as a matter of fact, specifically these spirals, and some of the scallops, that's Welsh. That's what we would find on the British Isles in those Welsh quilts. Now, the Welsh quilts also had leaves, which, I mean, this is kind of reminiscent of leaves up here. Leaves or orange peels. I would say that this quilt obviously has a Welsh influence. Now, you know, I mean, Scots-Irish is like I feel like Scotch-Irish is sort of a misnomer. You know, it's sort of a mixed up, jumbled up terminology for people that came from the British Isles and settled on the East Coast of the United States. That's really what it is. You know, my family, some of them Appalachian, South Carolina, others coastal North Carolina. You know, they always went back and forth between, oh, we're Irish, oh, we're Scottish, oh, we're of the English. My DNA says Welsh. So I kind of wonder how much of Scotch-Irish actually means Welsh. I don't know. I do think though it's in, you know, this is something that I've not really done like hard, fast research on, but I know enough people that come from these regions, including myself. And, you know, now that DNA is a thing, even without our genealogy, we're kind of starting to narrow down on what it means, you know, from these early settlers. So, okay, comparisons. We've looked at the detailed features of this quilt and now should consider where it fits in the chronology of American quilts by asking some questions. Questions are good. What was its forerunner? The glazed wool whole cloth quilt was an earlier bed cover and often more elegant. Widths of one solid color wool material were seamed together, interlined, and backed. Using this full top as a single large square, designs of natural forms, such as pineapples, palm leaves, grapes, and vines, flowers, and feathers, were arranged in mirror image in an overall design. The quilting was the only design element, and close rows of diagonal groundwork made the intricate patterns stand out in relief. Is this 1809 square set as diamonds quilt one of a kind? No. The Smithsonian has such a quilt made by Lucy Adler in New Hampshire with the same design and colors, but it employs a different naturalistic rather than geometric quilting in every square. Did embroidered designs influence these quilting designs? Plain weave blankets were woven and then marked off into squares, and large checks were woven into blankets, both creating plain squares in which wool embroidery was worked in the same period as this quilt. You find the fundamentals of lines, curves, intersecting circles, but the designs seem to be based in natural forms rather than geometric forms and are more complex. The embroidered blankets do have the sampler variation idea rather than one repetitive design. The picture in Susan Burroughs Swan's book, Plain and Fancy, which I actually have on my bookshelf, I looked at it this morning, shows wool embroidery on wool squares set as diamonds. One design is made of circular shapes left and right of a principal vertical line. So, yeah, I wish I'd known about that. I would have dragged that book out. Are there other quilts conceived with a sampler idea? The album, or friendship quilt, made 20 to 30 years later, often appeared to be a sampler of design blocks. However, the purpose of demonstrating the individuality of each friend's effort seems quite different from the design experimentation on our quilt. Conclusions. You realize by now that this is not an extraordinary quilt, that it followed the early American practice of saving all fabric for future use and of using what was at hand, that its maker was an average needlewoman. That much of the quilting was freehand, that it was not planned as a work of art, that it is rural and not high style, that it recorded designs for future references, and that it could possibly stem from a Scotch-Irish heritage. I have included 18th century with the early 19th century comparisons because of the fabric, and also because of the lag in time when styles of furniture, decorative arts, and clothing were popular in an urban area, and when those same styles were interpreted in a sparsely populated area. For me, this study quilt, despite its worn appearance, has provided an incentive to read sources unknown to me before, and to reread familiar works on weaving, quilting, and textiles in general. It has stimulated a need for me to visit curators and staff members at the Smithsonian Institution, Winterthur Museum, William Penn Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It has given me an excuse to talk with my friends in the textile field and courage to visit some outstanding antique dealers in New York. Finally, it demonstrates the value of retaining damaged fabrics in their entirety for detailed examination, an approach which provides for another perspective for quilt study. And that is Tandy Hirsch's paper in Volume 3 of Uncoverings. So, like I said, I mean, that kind of gives you a taste of what it might be like to look at a quilt. Now, obviously, quilts that have different, are not, it's not just the quilting we're looking at. You would have the piecing or the applique or whatever it is to look at, and then the quilting itself. So you would have more elements to examine, depending on what how the quilt was made and what era it was made. So, but I thought that one was like a kind of a good, just sort of general look at how one studies a quilt. Okay, so I'm going to jump around a little bit in this one. We'll read. This gets into some kind of lengthy stuff, which some of it is kind of not relevant anymore. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and start this one. So as I said, this next one we're going to read is Quilt Documentation, a step-by-step guide. And the book in this case is Pieced by Mother, Over 100 Years of Quilt Making Traditions by Jeanette Lasansky. And of course, Jeanette and Tandy Hirsch knew each other back in the day because they were in the same geographic region, and they were publishing together in the same publication. So we can fairly certainly know that they worked together. Okay, so this chapter is called Quilt Documentation: A Step-by-Step Guide. And the picture here is something that is probably not necessarily, well, I take that back. Quilt documentation, they do often still use paper, but they enter it into a digital form. I have not been to a quilt documentation, actually ever. I've seen them occur, in, videos and stuff. And it typically, what I've seen is, the person who, like the intake person, has got a laptop. So, I think paper in a lot of places is just going away, but, I do think that there's some that probably, they kind of start off with some paper and then they transition it into an online file, particularly like with the quilt index, etc. And I would imagine now today, some of these documentation projects have their own database that stuff is going into. So, quilt documentation, a step-by-step guide. Quilt documentation days are unpredictable and often hectic sessions, but they can be handled smoothly with advanced preparation. The following describes in detail how the Oral Traditions Project planned and executed such sessions. So the Oral Traditions Project was kind of why this book and the symposium papers, they came out as part of this Oral Traditions Project. I don't know a lot of details about it, but it's happening, I'm assuming, in Pennsylvania, because I know that's what a lot of this is about. And this is where both Jeanette and Tandy Hirsch were at the time in the 80s. This is 1987, by the way, this book. Yeah. So, Peace by Mother, 1987. While we know that there are many approaches to documentation, we also know that it is helpful to have another research team's methods available when starting out. We found the methods described below to be particularly successful. These procedures have been adapted over the span of 2 large multi-county projects, which recorded thousands of quilts. Thousands! Oh my gosh. They will provide a solid foundation for any project that aims to see large numbers of historical quilts and to adequately record them. So, and I'm skipping over some stuff. So, the first part is establishing contacts. It is important, as such research efforts go further afield and get larger, that a project work not only with one, but a number of appropriate organizations. We found it was very helpful to have a documentation day co-sponsored by the local historical society, the Home Economist of the Agricultural Extension Service, and women's sewing groups. Granges, ladies' aid societies, local museum staffs, and quilt guilds are other groups which could co-sponsor these efforts. And a lot of times now it's quilt museums, other types of museums. Like I know BAMFA up in Berkeley, California, they have hosted African American documentation, quilt documentation project a number of times. My colleague Adana is in charge of that. Adana Richardson. That's her. Her group it's the African American Quilt Documentation and Study Group, I think, is her total title. And BAMFA, which is the Berkeley area, BAM, Berkeley area. It's like something and film archives. The Berkeley Art Museum, basically. Like they've done so, and they're not specifically a quilt museum, although they have Eli Leon's quilts now. But places like that now is where you'll see. And I think so many people are interested in quilt documentation these days that when one happens, there's always lots of people that are interested in helping out and volunteering. So they're a little bit different than I think they were back in the day, like back in the 80s and 90s. But they are still going on, just probably not with the fervor that they were in the 80s and 90s. I mean, thousands of quilts. That's not happening today. I know some of the quilt museums, they'll have documentation days, and I mean, we're talking like, probably when they're busy, 15 or 20 quilts maybe. And that can sometimes be a lot. Co-sponsoring meant that the groups agreed to find an appropriate location once we clearly outlined our needs, that they put our press releases in their organization's newsletters and helped to get proper and repeated coverage in their local newspapers and on their radio stations. Can you imagine? I think of like some of the radio stations here in Baltimore, like I can't imagine, like, hey, it's Quilt Documentation Day. That they followed through by watching and listening for this coverage, and if it were not forthcoming or entirely correct, that they worked to get it right, that they be listed as a local contact for inquiries, and that they knew exactly the parameters of the project, such as the age of quilts being looked at and provenance, and in this way eliminated a misunderstanding and confusion on the day of documentation. So I would guess that, if they're only looking for documentation of, like, say, older quilts, they might be, saying like, these quilts need to be like pre-20th century or pre-1950 or something like that. That they're specifically looking for antique quilts and not like vintage or contemporary quilts. So she also mentions, having lecture series on old quilts prior to the documentation day. That's, I guess, another way of getting people interested. And I feel like, I mean, that kind of info, like today, I think it's still as relevant today. Now, you wouldn't necessarily be worried about newspapers and radio stations today. Be more worried about, social media and emails, right? Okay, establishing parameters. Our areas of interest were comforts, quilts, quilt tops, and sample patches completed prior to 1940. Okay, so there's their parameter. And known to have been made by a woman living in one of 15 central Pennsylvania counties, or to have come out of an old area home at auction. So I think they're, as much as possible, trying to make it quilts that were made in Pennsylvania or by Pennsylvania women. In these cases, where the newspapers, newsletters, radio, or word of mouth conveyed this information accurately and completely, we did not find ourselves having to turn away recently made quilts or quilts from out of the region. This proved to be exceedingly helpful. If people came with quilts from another area, we recorded their name, address, phone number, and the source of their quilts for future reference. After much trial and error, we found that planning the documentation day effort for a Sunday afternoon produced the most consistent results. Usually 150 to 200 quilts brought in by 60 to 75 families and individuals. People could come from 1 p.m. to 6 p.m., and they usually arrived early. 12:30 was common, but rarely came as late as 5 p.m. They came in family groups, since on a Sunday it was treated as a family outing, and this proved helpful as often a combination of people contributed to knowledge of the quilt maker or the circumstances of the making of the quilt. For those who came thinking that they would see a quilt show, we prepared a statement that clarified what we were actually doing that day. It also helped that those who came remembering a little but not all of what the local press release had said. And this is the press release. What's happening here? ? This is not a quilt show or sale, but rather an in-depth research effort being conducted by the Oral Traditions Project of the Union County Historical Society and hosted by your County Historical Society, Library, Home Economist, etc. People have been asked to come with their old quilts, comforts, tops, pieces, and patches, objects which were made by local women prior to 1940 for the home, family, and friends. The project personnel ask owners about the makers when known, about the ownership history of their quilts, and take down information about the piece, such as measurements and fabric type, and take study photographs. They hope to see about 1,500 quilts in an 8-county region: Sullivan, Columbia, Montour, Dauphin, Cumberland, Perry, Juniata, and Huntingdon counties. And they go on to mention this nonprofit group will publish a book on our area's quilts and have a major exhibition of about 150 of them. 150 quilts is a lot. At Bucknell University starting May 10th, 1987, as well as a 3-day national symposium on quilt making traditions. They have already published 2 books on area quilts. And, today, if you go out and look for the quilt documentation books, some of them were quite some time ago. You'll find I have probably more than a dozen. And some of them are kind of like sort of spotty. Some of them are very regional. The Maryland documentation book surprisingly has a lot of Eastern Shore quilts, not as many like in Baltimore, and surprisingly not a whole lot of Baltimore album quilts in the Maryland documentation book, which leads me to believe probably a lot of the really good Baltimore album quilts are already in museums, or were already in museums by the time the Maryland documentation was done. Either that, or people that still have those quilts were not coming out with them. But I suspect, so few true Baltimore album quilts were made and still in Baltimore that the museums had gotten them before the documentation happened. But it's interesting to notice things like that. And it's something that I guess you don't know until it happens, right? Okay, so site concerns. In order to accommodate our staff of 10 to 12, yeah, you need lots of hands. Because quilts are, they're bulky. They're, it takes 2 people to adequately fold a quilt, So yeah, I could definitely see 10 or 12 is probably the sweet spot for a couple hundred quilts. So staff of 10 to 12, the co-sponsor staff or volunteers, as well as the quilts and their owners. A large church social room proved best for our purposes. Since our efforts were on Sundays, it usually meant that we arrived around noon and moved into the social room to arrange tables and chairs just as soon as the church members left, some staying on with their quilts. Signs directed people into the correct door and out another if possible to provide easy traffic flow. At the entrance, there was a series of tables that were usually staffed by members of the co-sponsoring organizations. The first table had desk copies of our publications for people to examine, the handout that stated what's happening here, information on additional quilt documentation days, and the forthcoming show, the sign-up sheet for those who brought quilts from out of the area, and the registration tags. Each family or person bringing in quilts was given a numbered registration tag that would be keyed into all of their quilts. That would be keyed into all their quilts, the documentation cards that would subsequently be filled out, and the study photography. So obviously these documentation cards, such as you see in this picture, again, probably not used much now. It was essential that the greeter ascertain if the person had quilts from one or several owners. If the quilts represented more than one owner, they received the corresponding number of tags. Families would then go to those tables located directly behind the greeters, and with the help of local volunteers, they would fill out the pink owner card and yellow maker card, and then wait for a documentation table to be free in order to have their quilts recorded on white documentation cards. So that's what we're looking at here. At that juncture, a volunteer was stationed, ready to call registration numbers as documentation tables became available. It proved best to arrange the documentation tables so that they followed the sides of the room. We preferred large-sized tables that were often in these social rooms. Before we began, we made sure that the tables were clean and free of anything that might snag a quilt. Only one documenter would be at a table unless there was a new team member who was training. The documenters would be seated with their backs to the wall, facing a group of 2 or 3 chairs on the other side of the table. We learned to put several chairs there to accommodate the different family members and/or their quilts, since some families brought as many as 2 dozen. Oh my God. Can you imagine one group walking in with 2 dozen quilts? 2 dozen quilts is a lot. A dozen quilts is a lot. Once they're folded up in a stack, I mean, that's a lot. Supplies. We can move on to a different picture too. So these are, just as a note, these are posters published by the Work Progress Administration in Pennsylvania in the 30s. And then they were a reproduction, like republished a number of years ago. And I just missed out on getting one of the reproduction versions, which are very nice. I do have an older version, which is not complete, but they're very pretty. They're really, really pretty to look at. But that's what these are, and there's multiple pages of them that I'll pull up. Okay, so the supplies for documenting quilts. The documenters had at their table, as well as at a resupply table, the following. Pencils only, no pens. And that's because a pencil mark is not as harmful and can technically be spot cleaned out. Pen marks, forget about it. You have to use chemicals, and nobody wants, and I mean, this is like a kind of a standard like museum thing. Like you can bring a pencil into most archives, museums, libraries, that kind of thing. But they better not see you pulling like a marker or a pen out. A cloth measuring tape, additional copies of the owner card, maker card, and many quilt documentation cards, a stamped self-addressed envelopes to give to those families who could find out more about the maker and were willing to send in a more complete maker card later. So, and I mean, that's nice to give somebody like a self-addressed stamped envelope that, because I think sometimes people will be like, oh, I'll get around to sending that in later. But if they have, like, all they have to do is write the additional info once they find it out and then drop it in the mail, I'm sure that probably helped with this project. Post-it notes to attach to any of the cards when it was necessary to bring attention to interesting social history, pattern, remark on condition, etc. And on very busy days to count but not document certain quilt types. So, and then the white tags that would be numbered and lettered, then temporarily attached to a quilt's corner with a small brass safety pin. Now, I have a quilt that went through a Maryland documentation project in the county just north of me. Their tag was actually a cloth tag, and it looked like it was written with like a Sharpie or a laundry marker. And then it had kind of been whip stitched to the back of the quilt. So I think that like every quilt documentation project probably did some of this a little bit differently. And of course today the supplies would probably be similar, except not those cards. They would have a laptop. But my guess is they still do have writing stuff for people, just to kind of like if they need to jot things down, etc. Okay. The numbering system. Our documentation system depends on the correct numbering and labeling of the quilts and their series of color-coded cards. This process of information gathering begins with the volunteers at the first tables and then is confirmed and elaborated on by the documenter at her table. His or her table, I say. Here's another look at more of those posters. Time and concentration are necessary to make sure that this numbering is done correctly. For example, an owner approaches the documenter with her quilts, the number which was assigned as she entered, and the owner and maker cards she filled out for her quilt, which are keyed into the assigned registration number. If 2 owners are together and want to stay together that afternoon, they should be given 2 separate registration numbers. Sometimes one person will have brought the quilts of several friends or neighbors and consequently have several numbers, one for each owner. I could see where this could get confusing. So you have to make sure people like keep things organized. The documenter first needs to make sure that the assignment of the numbered registration tags by the greeters and the subsequent filling out of the cards with the assigned numbers complete. If not, additional registration tags and cards should be obtained. The documenter then separates each owner's quilts in piles by maker and or the different circumstances of ownership history. This step helps confirm that the already filled out cards are correct or in adding other information. In the simplest of situations, there was just the present owner who knew nothing other than that the quilts had been bought at a local sale. In that case, only one owner card was filled out. Then the documenter proceeded to document each quilt, filling out separate documentation cards for each, labeled, for instance, number 6, A through E. So quilt 6A would have its card filled out completely by the documenter and have a numbered and lettered tag, then pinned to one of its corners. Quilt number 6B would be next, and so forth. However, if the owner had quilts made by two different makers, as well as one bought at a sale, the one bought from the sale would have only an owner card and no maker card, while the others would have maker cards filled out as well. If Aunt Lydia made two quilts, they would be done next, numbered and labeled 6B and 6C, while two quilts made by Grandma Jones would be 6D and 6E. These letters must also be noted on the maker cards. I could see where this could get confusing. Okay. She goes on to talk much, much more about this. But I would say, the numbering systems I've seen are a little bit more detailed than this. I know the one quilt I own that was documented. I want to say it's it might be the year and then a dot and then a series of numbers. So she talks about the quilt documentation cards. So she said, we refined the quilt documentation cards as they were used over a number of sessions. They seemed logical and bare bones to us, but to someone else, there might be something out of sequence or missing. So you should make the necessary changes to suit your project and circumstances. More research could be done on any given quilt than is indicated by our series of questions. And for album, fundraising, or crazy quilts, we went on to record more on the cards' backs. So obviously there would be names in there. Fundraising could be names, organizations. There could be all kinds of stuff. Photography. Let's see how old school this is. Once all the cards are filled out and all of one owner's quilts are completed, they're directed to the photography area. This was the final step of the day. The principal researcher author was also the photographer, and in this way was able to see all of the objects firsthand. Photography needed to proceed efficiently and quickly, as this was where, especially on busy days, delay could occur. While the photographer had little to do in the beginning, she was busy throughout the afternoon and would still be at work long after the other members of the documentation effort were finished. Members of the co-sponsoring organizations often helped by holding quilts or placing them in a quilt photography frame. They also kept a list of those that were waiting and would call for the next person when the photographer was free. Chairs were arranged so that people waiting could, without moving, see the other quilts being photographed. It was preferable that the photography be done in an area that was separate but contiguous to the rest of the documentation effort. On very busy days, it might be necessary to have a second photographer for those few hours that become especially busy. When the quilts were ready to be photographed, the cards were looked at quickly and then put in a file box. The photographer, having previously labeled sheets of a long yellow pad A to Z and number 1 to 36 on each, would enter the number of each quilt being photographed next to the appropriate numbers on the roll. The number would be taken from the tag attached to the quilt, which the photographer would detach and put aside when photography began on the piece. Quilts did not have to be shot in any particular sequence. I can see how they could get mixed up. So here is where, so she's talking about processed film. So when the processed film was returned, it corresponded to the yellow sheets on which the quilt numbers were entered in the order in which they were shot, and which in turn corresponded to the appropriate owner, maker, and quilt document cards. Okay, but now I know some of the quilt documentations use a professional photographer, and the quilts are being laid out and hung. For instance, the African American quilt documentation and study, they are using a professional photographer. I've actually interviewed him. He's a delightful young man. He does photography and drone work and stuff like that, but he has everything lit, and he's photographing with a 35 millimeter DSLR fancy camera. But I would imagine probably some quilt documentations, as long as the lighting is good, you can document with your phone. I think phones today are pretty darn good. And if the lighting is good, you probably can take very good pictures. I would say that what I would do personally to make sure that numbers didn't get mixed up is to have a number card pinned to the quilt. And you take a picture, and that number card is there on the quilt. And then you could take that card away and take further pictures, right? I feel like, when you're not dealing with film, obviously film costs money. So you wouldn't want to be, just snap, 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 snap a million pictures of the quilt if you're working on film. But when you're working digitally, you can take all kinds of pictures. You can delete, you can look at them. Was it blurry? Did it not get the right color? You just delete it and take it again. So in some ways, I think the photography is actually much easier today than it was back then, because you know right away what you've got, and you're not limited, in how many photos you can take. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to skip over a little bit here. So, care, conservation, and use. Advice on the care, conservation, and use of old quilts is where we felt we could offer the most to the owners. We tried to reinforce those who are handling their heirlooms correctly and make suggestions to those who, usually unknowingly, were not. Some of the stories I've heard from people, what they do with their quilts, and I'm like, shudder, shudder. Never have we had owners not receptive to our concerns and advice. We usually told them of 2 recent articles on the subject, which we feel are written realistically for those quilts retained in homes. The first being, hey Jill, the first being Virginia Gunn's article, The Display, Care, and Conservation of Old Quilts. And this is in the Heart of Pennsylvania Symposium Papers. And Patty Orlovsky's The Collector's Guide for the Care of Quilts in the Home. That was published in the Quilt Digest. We'll have to look at those too, because I have both of those books. The most common questions were about the cleaning of quilts, a point on which everyone is more conservative these days. We urged people not to dry clean or wash their old quilts in a traditional manner, but to follow the advice given in the Gunn and Orlovsky articles. We urged them to use or display their quilts in a more conservative manner so as not to require cleaning as a result of that use, and to be able to accept the fact that many old quilts will have marks of age. We mentioned how, historically, quilts were aired more than washed. Indeed, washing was done once a year at most. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think it really depends on the quilt itself as to how often it was washed. And possibly also the era. I think in the 20th century, once we have washing machines of any type, even the old mangle press kind of thing, you probably saw quilts getting washed more than, say, in earlier times, the 1809 quilt. And I guess anything that's got wool in it, would be treated more like surface treatment than submersed. But I think once a year that may be off a little bit. The issue of storage often came up because the owners often brought the quilts in a plastic bag, which is of course fine to use that day for protection from a sudden rain, but not acceptable for long-term use, since the plastic does not breathe and can capture and hold moisture. We urged storage in a clean white sheet and told the owners not to fold the quilt as their mothers and grandmothers taught us to fold bedding in quarters. Often we pointed out deep crease marks that were already formed by the repeated folding of the quilt in this manner. After photographing their pieces, we showed them how, by refolding in thirds, this can be avoided. Also, we urged them not to store quilts piled on top of each other, causing stress on the fabrics as well as the needlework. I should take that advice, I guess. Let's see. So I'll skip some of this here. She's talking about quilt tops. So we'll skip that. Let's see. So other documentation efforts. It is helpful to be aware of other quilt documentation efforts, their standards and objectives, the compatibility of research efforts, in addition to issues concerning long-term and multiple use. Too often we are short-sighted and record only the information we think we need for a particular project, only to find out toward the end that we should have thought about more issues and gathered more information. Which, if you look at the Quilt Index, if you've ever gone to document a quilt on the Quilt Index, you will see pages and pages and pages of information that you can add. Now, certainly if you don't have the information, you can't add it. But if, for instance, it's a quilt made by yourself or your mother or your grandmother, and you know the answers to all of this stuff, then you could spend quite some time filling out that information. Because, I mean, it gets down into things like the religion of the quilt maker, and things like that. So, and I think all of that, for the Quilt Index came out of these documentation projects, realizing as they went, that there could be much more to find out. So let's see. The Oral Traditions Project is tempted to continue documenting quilt making traditions in other parts of Pennsylvania, and we have been urged to do so by others. But rather than spread out too thin and too far from home, it is time to encourage others to proceed in their respective territories, using the results and methods of projects such as ours in central Pennsylvania. Also, of Betts Ramsey and Mary Kay Waldvogel's efforts in Tennessee, Bettina Havoc and Sue Ellen Myers' projects in Missouri, Laurel Horton and Lynn Robertson Myers in South Carolina, Caroline Bressenhan and Nancy Puentes in Texas. You should know all of those names. With the exception of maybe one or two, I have mentioned all of those people at some time or another. In fact, my Bettina Havoc was the original owner of my American Quilts book that we have been reading from. So all of them ran or were involved in major documentation projects in those states. And she says that others are underway or being completed in California. The California one is ongoing. I know the president and one of the officers of the California project, and that one's ongoing. Ohio and North Carolina. It was very helpful to our second project's success to show what we had done in our first. And so that was published in the Heart of Pennsylvania, 19th and 20th century quilt making traditions. So I'm going to end with that. And there's a little bit more in here. Like I said, really good book. If you ever want to look at this stuff, it's very Pennsylvania focused, but I think this is such a great book. And the symposium papers that go along with it are also really good. So in our remaining time, let's look at pictures from American Quilts, formerly owned by Bettina Havoc. So let me go back here. Okay. Now let's see where we left off in here. We're looking at a lot of fabric, and I kind of want to skip ahead and look at some quilts. Because you know what? A lot of these toiles and chintz, they start looking the same. Let me see. Where did we leave off? Okay. let's look at two more of these fabrics because a couple of these are kind of interesting. Haha, very funny, Jill. All right. This one is interesting. Look at this. So this is Penn's treaty with the Indians. From the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And the reason why this one I think is cool is the way that, and I realize, I think these might be folds in the fabric, but you see how like it's the repeat makes like a pattern. So like if you stand back and look at this from like really far away, you're getting triangles. And you're not seeing the details obviously if you're far away, but you get this sense of triangles, whereas some of these other toiles are not like that. So I thought that was kind of neat. The other toiles we looked at the other day are like very, very broad scenes, or they're sort of just random. Like there's not like really a sense of like a repetitive pattern. And that's why I thought this one was kind of neat. Now on the next page there's also this, which I thought was kind of cool. Whoops. Nope. Yeah, here we go. This one. This one's very, very dense, but also has some very interesting like edges because they're really close up together. There's not a lot of white space around these illustrations. And this one is called Courtship and Marriage. Courtship and Marriage from the Edison Museum at Dearborn. So I'm trying to see what's happening in here. Yeah, I guess. Is this the wedding? Maybe? I don't know. This appears to be courtship here. All right. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to some quilts. Okay. So we got our first quilt here. So this is a crazy quilt by an unknown maker, but to which the following information is attached. This crazy quilt, my aunt helped piece the squares, and I worked all but 5 of them and painted all these that are painted. We both worked the border. Was made in the year 1878. So this is an earlier crazy quilt. Crazy quilts, their pinnacle was probably 1885. Is probably like the pinnacle. So this is an earlier one. Pretty interesting. It looks like you could kind of see it shiny, so that must be silk. Doesn't seem to have some of the traditional, like, once these things get real trendy, doesn't seem to have the stuff that they typically have. All right. Okay. This one, I like this one because much chintz, but also applique. So this is by the way, that last one was from the Chicago Historical Society. This one is from the Index of American Design. And she says, this is patchwork and chintz applique quilt with a chicken and flower pot designs. Yeah, I see a chicken. Okay. The varied colored chintz is on a white background, made about 1800 by Mary Satchwell. So, is this the chicken? I think, well, I don't know. That looks like a bird cut out of some chintz. I don't know. It looks like one of these birds, like a pheasant or something. I don't know if I'd call that a chicken. I don't know if that's a bird as well. But you see that the focal point is this big urn with a plant in it. There's some other little things going on here, but pretty cool. I don't know that I've seen anything like that from that early, right? 1800. Okay. Moving right along. So this one is from the Index of American Design. Crazy quilt with elaborate designs in small squares. Pattern in quilts began to appear in triangular pieces and squares such as these. Okay. um yeah, I mean, again, this is a crazy quilt, but also probably not the kind of crazy quilt we expect to see, because it is rather orderly for a crazy quilt. Like, each of the squares has got some embroidery, it looks like, and possibly some applique and stuff, but it's still quite orderly considering. Yeah. Oh, and it's 1883. Looks like it's upside down, but 1883. Um, and it does look like there's some of the things we would recognize from, crazy quilts, the embroidery for sure. Whatever this is, what is that? It's some animal maybe with a shell on its back. Is it? It's odd. Okay. Here's a nice sedate fan. So this one she's calling an example of Fanny's fan, a simple patchwork quilt with organized design. But I mean, you could say that this is a crazy quilt too, based on these other ones she's calling crazy quilts, because you've got the embroidery and you've got a bunch of different fabrics. You don't have necessarily embroidery within the blocks, but it's a shame these aren't in color. Okay. Up next is a terrible picture. This says a crazy quilt, patchwork crazy quilt made in 1899 at St. George, Utah. Notice how the names sewn on the quilt help to bring the design together. Huh, names, you say? I can't even begin. Okay. There's a name here, I think. I can't even tell what that is. Oh yeah, look at this. There are names. Look, there's a lot of them. Oh my gosh. That suddenly just came into focus for me. There's names all over this thing. Age 42. Oh my goodness. Yeah, there's 1899. Oh, that looks like that's a name there. Okay, this thing is encrusted in names. Wow. Okay. This is a splendid example of the hit or miss quilt, made of interesting pieces of copper plate and other color printed cottons. So I think I remember her talking about the hit or miss quilt and the fact that the next one is very similar to one I have. And I think it's just, the blocks aren't necessarily the same size. These blocks are much bigger than these. It's just sort of making it fit together, but not exactly like, more scrappy than like a crazy quilt. And then this one, let's see. Yeah, there we go. This is a medallion. And then kind of all this crazy stuff going on around it. So this one says, a very old design with the windmill center and hit or miss in the rest of the quilt. In the hit or miss quilts, we find organization of the size of the pieces of material used, but little in the arrangement of the material itself, as every old piece of printed cotton was used. Both of these have been from the Edison Museum in Dearborn, but yeah, the one I have, and I've shown it before. It's primarily like kind of blues and reds. It's got this really beautiful back on it, it's almost like a flannel, sort of like a flannelly fabric, but I would say it's probably turn of the century, maybe a little earlier, like 1890s. But she's not giving a date to these, so just saying very old. But I would call mine a hit or miss, I think. Okay. Oh, hold on to your log cabin loving hearts. This is not a super picture, but look at this. The things one can do with a log cabin. You guys, I love a log cabin. So this is from the Brooklyn Museum. And this, she says, is a fine 19th century log cabin pieced quilt designed with a cross in the center and square bands of different colored cotton materials. So there's some like really interesting fabrics in here. I like the stripy stuff, some polka dots, or some kind of little tiny floral, maybe. Whatever this little thing is. And it's just by virtue of how you place your lights and darks that you get all of these wild designs with log cabins. They are so magical. Okay, this one. So this is a log cabin. Oh, see, that last one was from the Brooklyn Museum. Yeah, this one is from the Index of American Design. She says this is a log cabin pieced quilt in homespun and hard twilled woolen materials. I don't know what hard twilled woolen is, but as opposed to soft twilled or easy twilled, I don't know. With a bright red in the center of each block. And I mean, I think typically lots of log cabins back then had like a bright red in the center. And you know, there's that old wives' tale, like it's supposed to represent like the hearth of the home or something like that. I mean, I could see that being true. But it is still just an old wives' tale, you know. But I feel like this one, they're much more prominent here. So if these are indeed red, they're a very, very dark, dark red. I think maybe these might not be red. She doesn't say. Okay. Gorgeous. Okay, here's some more. So the top one is from the Brooklyn Museum. And let's see, these are details from 2 log cabins made in the 19th century. The log cabin type of pieced quilt was so called because of the long strips or log-shaped pieces of material used. There is more design in these than in the hit or miss, or, of course, in the crazy quilts, examples which appear on preceding pages. So, yeah, that's a log cabin. That is too. I wish, like I said, I wish these were in color, but you know, uh-oh. There we go. You know, this was written in 1948. And I don't know if I said, I mean, you guys know by now, this is American Quilts by Elizabet Wells Robertson. But this one's interesting. This looks like a very, very big log cabin. Oh, it's made for a doll's bed in the early 19th century. So this looks like it was probably a part. So it's four blocks across. Very cool. I would love to have seen that in color. Yeah, and you can see the little curves here of the binding. Aw, little doll's quilt. Okay. Pieced quilts. Got a lot of stars. So this one is, I feel like we've seen this one. This might have been in like Florence Pito's stuff because it's Staten Island. So this is the Index of American Design, and she says a multicolored patchwork and applique quilt of chintz and calico with Star of Bethlehem center. It was made about 1812 by the Drake family of Staten Island. The pieced quilts of this category show a real sense of design and craftsmanship. The color and the materials were fully organized into the design. So we'll look at 2 more, and then I think we'll call it a day, because then she gets into some other stuff. But look at this. These birds. And look how these different sized urns are tucked in here. Oh my goodness. Little tiny urn, and then the bigger urn. That's wild. I love that. Look how it just tucks right in there. And then look at this border. They're like little bows. This inner border. Gosh, there's a lot going on there. It's a very, very densely appliqued and quilted thing, I would guess. No, we don't see the quilting. You'd have to look at the back of it to see the quilting, I'm sure. Okay, this one's pretty interesting because of these additions. And here, this sort of, I don't know, daisy-like flower with these tulips. So this says, another striking Star of Bethlehem design, and she's calling it Rainbow Star, with a total of 1,352 pieces in the center star, 167 in each of the 8 points. It was made in Lebanon, Pennsylvania around 1850 and has an air of Pennsylvania Dutch about it. So I gathered that from these tulips and these kind of crossed symbols. It looks like the petals are the leaves and stems of the tulip kind of almost create this circular look here, even though that's not a circle, just the way that they fold over. Wish I could see it in color. Ugh. Okay, and we'll make the next one the last one. So this is one of those Rebecca Scattergood quilts, I bet. Let's see if that's what it is. No, it doesn't name her, but if you'll remember the Rebecca Scattergood quilts, just like that. And you can see by virtue of where you have to switch the direction of the diamond to keep it, to keep the design going. So you can see that division there. So I think that these would be made very similarly to the Bethlehem Star, except you never come out, like you never decrease back out to a point. You just like lop it off. But these different colored like kind of rings really make it your eyes kind of when you look at these in color. So in this case, it's kind of nice to look at it in black and white because you can't, your eyes aren't going crazy with the color. It also has a really interesting border fabric. So she says, a beautiful pieced quilt with a variety of different printed materials arranged in octagonal rings of small diamonds with a star center and corners and a border with bird and garlands. So very pretty, very complex. All right. Well, that is going to do it for today. We still have some more quilts to look at in here. And, there's a couple that are actually familiar to us. So we'll get to those on Thursday and we'll finish the book. So this has been an interesting book, I would say. So I think this week's a pretty ordinary week for me, knocking on wood. Look forward to seeing you on Thursday. You're going for a walk, Druid. I'm glad the weather is amenable to that. I'm having a little rain and chilliness today, so I have to run out after this though. So yeah, so I'll see you on Thursday. Have a wonderful week, you guys. Bye. Mwah!